Hello, BookTube. I've got a brief, sketchy, currently reading video for you, I guess we could call it. It's not much and it won't be long because I am still up to my eyeballs in a writing and researching project, although most of the research is happening on the fly now. Most of it is just writing, but a large amount of writing. To speak euphemistically, it's a large amount of writing. And my deadline for it is dawn tomorrow. So I really don't have the time for anything else except for Frida. I'm not stinting Frida at all, my little schnauzer who's not here right now. She's off on her beanbag. Uh, Aside from her, though, everything else is taking a major hit. And I've already given a huge amount of my, what I guess I could call my discretionary time today, to Ami on Ami's channel, 8675309, or whatever his channel is called. Where we had a Zoom conversation. It was a chunk of time. It was really fun. The only reason that I'm not making a separate announcement video for that and leaving a link is because he sometimes takes time to post it. It's not like when I do a Zoom chat where we finish the Zoom chat and then I just post it. So I don't know if he'll do that today. That might be next week. He just had a video up this morning, so he might wait a while. Originally I thought, well, that will have to be it for video content today, because I'm in crunch time. I just cannot justify the time. But then I thought, well, you can't say that because that video won't be out today. In all likelihood, that won't be out today. So I thought I'd make a video just to chat with you a bit today, just a bit about books, various things that I've been reading, books and magazines. It's not much because, I mean, reading for me is an absolutely ingrained habit. My day seems unthinkable without it. This project has to push it aside. It just has to. And I know that, but that's still unthinkable. So I have been doing some reading. I've been justifying it to myself as just a way to recharge mental batteries, which, for all I know, it might be. Like, for instance, in terms of periodicals, I read the new Harper's Magazine, which has a piece by John Jeremiah Sullivan, who I really, really like. It's a shame to me that I can't read the piece by him that's in this issue, because this is what it is. It's called Man Called Fran by John Jeremiah Sullivan. And I don't know if you can tell from that first page, but you're certainly able to tell from the second and third page. This is what it looks like. It's one paragraph. It's continuous prose with no breaks, no rhythm, no syncopation of any kind. I looked at that. I looked at the formatting of that and discounted it completely. I will not read it. So that was a bit of a shame. That stings a little because I like this author. But if you've got your head up your butt so far that you think that's a good idea, then the piece would be worth reading anyway. But I did spend time reading the big attention-grabbing cover piece. This is who wrote this piece? Justin E.H. Smith wrote What Happened to Gen X. Douglas Copeland gets a name check in here for inventing the name Generation X. And the profile goes on about the various characteristics of Gen X and their disillusionments and whatnot. David Bowie gets a mention, the rise of corporate culture. Reagan and Thatcher get a mention, of course, a couple of mentions. And at the end of the article, the author is confused. He professes to be confused. Why is it that Gen X is so invisible? Why is it that when people are having these so-called generational conversations about the import or the dire meaning or what of Gen X, Y, or Z, this one never comes up. This one seems to have slipped between the cracks of those kinds of discussions. He just ends his article on a big chin-stroking note of ponderment. And when I read the article, I thought, I may have said out loud, you're providing the answer right here in the article as to why that is true. Because you can talk about Gen X in terms of their questionable music taste, their questionable life decisions. You could say that the fault for a lot of their ills is in themselves and not in their stars because they massively sold out. You can say a whole bunch of things about Gen X, but one thing you can say about them beyond any doubt, most of the time, is incredibly epitomized in this article, which is that Gen X is constitutionally incapable of telling the truth. about anything, ever. There will, of course, be outliers, probably a lot of exceptions are listening to me now. But as a rule, to define a generation, there isn't any other generation that for whom that can be said, and it can be said for 99% of Gen X. This author is lying throughout the whole course of his article. Every chin-stroking hypothetical that he raises is something that he does not consider chin-stroking. He does not consider it puzzling. All of the hypothetical questions that he raises are not hypothetical, and he knows the answers. It's just, I'm not willing to blame them completely. They were probably screwed up by their parents. It was a pretty brutal generation to be raised by, but I'm wondering what you think of this article if you take Harper's and you've read it, especially if you are Gen X. If you are Gen X, I'm sure that you are the exception to my rule, but I wonder if you will disagree with me. So that was one thing I read. I ordinarily, when I'm talking about stuff that I've been reading, I wouldn't stoop to mentioning the 15 minutes it took to read a magazine article, but I'm doing precious little reading these days. One bit of rereading that I'm doing was spurred by BookTube. I mentioned the other day that in Last Week in BookTube, I did a Last Week in BookTube video, and a lot of you have been emailing me saying that you really liked it. It reminded me that every time I go back to the format of Last Week in BookTube, I always get emails like that, people saying, please keep doing this. I always just automatically associate it with contention, because it was a source of a bad weekend of contention, but that was 7 years ago, almost a decade ago. But I mentioned in that Last Week in BookTube video that Michael K Vaughan is doing an event, of course. Who else does events on BookTube other than Michael K Vaughan? The busiest guy on the platform, and yet he's constantly loading himself with new things. And he came up with the idea to read Conan in September, Cimmerian September, where you go to the original Robert E. Howard Conan stories and read them. There's that big collected Conan, but there are also 3 volumes from Ballantine that are really good. They're illustrated. They're carefully curated. And I pointed out, a while ago that you could get all of Robert E. Howard's writings on Conan done in the month of September. It wouldn't take all that much. It wouldn't be an unrealistic thing. If you gave your reading in September over to Robert E. Howard's Conan, you could get it done. It's 30 pages a day. So you could do it in the month of September, and then you'd have it all done. There wouldn't be any Robert E. Howard original Conan stories that you hadn't read. That is the event, is to read Robert E. Howard's Conan in September. Naturally, I am taking a different path. I love Robert E. Howard Conan stories. I absolutely love them. But I decided on the spur of the moment that my Cimmerian September would be the Savage Sword of September. I'm going to go to Marvel Comics' old run of the Savage Sword of Conan, their black and white comic book. They did a black and white magazine of Conan at the same time that they were publishing Conan the Barbarian in full color in a normal comic book size. And the Conan the Barbarian stories were governed by the Comics Code Authority, and the black and white magazines were not. They weren't sold in the same part of the dry goods store or the drugstore. They were presumably aimed at a different audience, nominally anyway, an older audience. And so in the Savage Sword of Conan stories, when Conan wants to bed a wench, you can see it. And especially when Conan wants to cut someone's hands off, you can see it. It's not the violence and the mature content, as the euphemism that we use, is far more explicit. Almost all of those, a huge number of those, 200 out of 260, were written by Roy Thomas. He was a big Conan fan, but he revamps a lot of stories, takes stories from all over and changes them into Conan stories. And he's aided and abetted for a large chunk of that run by the great artist John Buscema. And I decided that I was going to reread, or in my case, actually read, because every issue of Savage Sword of Conan. I loved Savage Sword of Conan when it came out. I bought it and read it religiously. They started to stack up all over the place. And then I fell off, and the magazine seemed to get worse. The artwork stopped being by anyone good. A lot of times the writing was farmed out to somebody else. So I was not reading Savage Sword of Conan for the last few years of its publication. There are a lot of issues out there that I have not read. So I'm going to read all of them for September. I don't think I'm completely violating whatever nebulous rules of Conan in September there are. Of course, this is Michael K Vaughan, so you know that if he's going to say rules, he's going to say them firmly tongue-in-cheek. If you want to celebrate Conan in September, that's fine, I'm sure. But the rules are that you read Robert E. Howard's Conan. And I'm probably going to end up doing that, as well as Savage Sword of Conan. I've found it over the years that when I get into a Conan kick, when something pushes me into a Conan phase, I can't get enough of the world of this character, whether it's Robert E. Howard or the infinite pastiche novels or the infinite comic books. I can't get enough of it usually once I dip my toe in. That happened years and years and years ago. I did Cimmerian Summer, actually, for the lead up to Jay Momoa's Conan movie, which I was very much looking forward to it. I was really hoping that it would be really good. I think it turned out to be really good. I was also hoping it would be the beginning of a franchise, and I think everyone involved was hoping too. It was an inspired choice of casting. Something about it was wrong. I think I know ultimately why the Jason Momoa Conan movie did not really take off. I think I know why. If generally speaking, if you're doing the sword and sorcery template, you can't stint on either one. And Conan in the Jason Momoa Conan movie, not only does Conan not fight enough people, but he doesn't fight enough supernatural either. There's just not enough of either. It should have been a little more pronounced in both. The characterization of Conan was spot on, I thought, for the first time on the big screen. Oddly enough, ironically enough, you wait long enough, since we get, in Robert E. Howard's stories of Conan, you get the whole of Conan's life. Get him from when he was a boy until when he was a grizzled old man. Ironically enough, Jason Momoa would now be one. If I can't have my dream cast of Arnold Schwarzenegger playing Conan in a movie version of The Phoenix on the Sword, if I can't have that, Jason Momoa would be a perfect casting for Conan now, when he's twice as big and older, more grizzled, I think much more accomplished as a big screen presence. I think he'd be a great casting for an older Conan now. The neat thing about Robert E. Howard Conan stories is that we have great stories from every period of his life. That would be wonderful. Even though his original movie did not spawn a franchise, it would still be great if it spawned a sequel. He's a big enough property now, so I think he could probably make that happen. I just don't know how interested he is. But during that whole summer, the whole summer of that movie, I was, on my old blog, Steve Reads, I was writing about Conan nonstop and reading it and rereading it nonstop and having a blast. And I was thinking about Cimmerian September, and I realized that was the last time I did that. So I'm geared to do it again. I will probably be doing a lot of Conan reading in September, not just the Savage Sword of Conan. But nevertheless, Conan does feature in this currently reading thing because Mike made a video yesterday about a series of Conan novels that were highly instrumental in introducing people to the character of Conan the Barbarian, but that have lots and lots of problems of their own. And these were the Conan mass market paperbacks done by L. Sprague de Camp and Lynn Carter, usually with great Frank Frazetta covers. That if you're of a certain age, this would be how you were introduced to Conan. This would be how you knew about the character at all, and probably came to love the character. Here you get, in these books, you get collections of stories, you get maps of the Hyborian Age, you get usually editorial stuff. There's always an introduction by L. Sprague de Camp, but also sometimes essays. The life cycle of Conan, the life story of Conan. So on one level, a really energetic introduction to this character and this world, and maybe by extension this author, done by two huge fans, actually three huge fans. L. Sprague de Camp, Lynn Carter, and Bjorn Nyborg were huge fans of Conan, of Robert E. Howard. So we're not talking about opportunistic carpetbaggers here trying to make a buck on stuff they don't care about. No. That was the intention of these books, I believe, was good. But if you watch Mike's video, I'll try and leave a link to it down below because it's really, really good. He knows this character and this character's publication history inside and out, and is, I think, his foremost fan on BookTube, his foremost champion. It's a really good video, and it points out that it would be one thing if Lynn Carter and L. Sprague de Camp and Bjorn Nyborg and also Glenn Lord, Robert E. Howard's literary executor, it'd be one thing if they went through Howard's papers, organized all the Conan stuff that he did, that big fat volume, all the Conan stuff that he did, about 1,000 pages, organized it all, neatened it up, fixed obvious typos, that sort of thing, and then presented it in a series of Conan books. Here are the writings of Conan the Barbarian by his creator. Now, some of those are going to be problems, right? Because some of that stuff was found in Howard's possessions after he killed himself. He didn't set his papers in order. In other words, his friends, his fans, his super fans, his literary executors had to go and do that. And in those papers, they found some things. They found stories that were relatively complete. They found stories that were half complete. So, not half drafted, but half complete. So, half of one story is written. Crossouts on the typeface page. The care that Robert E. Howard put into his prose on the page. And then it stops. And the second half is maybe 1 page of jottings, of notes, but no prose at all. So if you're going to do the kind of variorum edition that your literary executor and your friends should want to do when they go through your papers like that, that's exactly how you're going to present that. And that is not what Lynn Carter and L. Sprague de Camp and Glenn Lord did. That's not what they did. Instead, they took all of those stories, many of which had been manhandled by editors of various magazines. They had the typescripts of the originals. They knew what the originals were like. A lot of times they just went with the manhandled versions. When they found half-completed stories, L. Sprague de Camp finished them. Just finished them. You can actually, this is the first of these Conan volumes I'm talking about, and in the table of contents, you can actually see what I'm talking about. See that? You've got story by Robert E. Howard or by Howard and L. Sprague de Camp. Mike is entirely right. In his video, he points out that no matter what you feel about Robert E. Howard, or no matter what you think about pulp literature, you shouldn't do that. That is unacceptable. I have been making this point for a long, long time. I have to say, I never made it about Conan. I loved these books when they were coming out. I love the fact that they were spreading the word. I love the fact they were teaching me a lot about this character. And I sort of looked the other way at the editorial interference that was being done to the writings themselves. I didn't group it all in terms of this kind of desecration in other parts of literature. And I should have. Looking back, I should have. If you had told me, if someone had come out with volume number 30 of John Carter of Mars, and it was a collection of short stories that said Edgar Rice Burroughs and Ray Bradbury, I'd have howled bloody murder. I said, what do you mean? This isn't a John Carter story. If it's not by Edgar Rice Burroughs, it's not a John Carter story. If you want to write fan fiction, go ahead, but call it that. I would have screamed bloody murder when it came to Edgar Rice Burroughs' Barsoom Tales, but I didn't do it when it came to Conan. Shame on me. Instead, what I thought was, it never occurred to me to link it with examples from literature. Like, for instance, for 200 years after Shakespeare popped his clogs, people would routinely rewrite his plays. Even my boy John Dryden. People would routinely rewrite his plays to, I don't know, have Romeo and Juliet live and live happily ever after. Or to fix things here or there, or neaten something up, or add to the drama, or something like that. And people flocked to those plays that were called Shakespeare. We don't do that anymore. No one prints those anymore. I think it'd be fun if somebody did, but no one prints those anymore, and certainly no one stages them anymore. And also, my number one marquee example of all this is, of course, Plutarch. the ancient writer Plutarch wrote gradually over the course of his whole life, admittedly never in one place, the parallel lives. A Roman life, a Greek life, an essay comparing the two, a Roman life, a Greek life, an essay comparing the two. Not a complete work, but it is massive, and it was intended as a work. It was not intended as an encyclopedia. It was not intended as a mine where you go in with pickaxe and chisel out what you want and then trundle it out to publish separately. And yet, that is how Plutarch has been treated for 2,000 years. You'd be hard-pressed to find a complete, loving, annotated, respectful version of the parallel lives. You certainly won't find one in any of the major reprint lines. The most they'll do is reprint something that was done by Dryden, that was done centuries ago. The idea that no one has thought that way about the parallel lives, and that is horrible. We shouldn't think that way about literature of any kind. No matter what you think of its literary quality, the very least that we owe any writer is their own work. That's the very least that we owe them. So in retrospect, I see that these old paperbacks were probably bad. They were probably a bad idea. They did a lot of good. I don't think that even their worst detractor would say that they didn't. They introduced a lot of people to this character. They conveyed a lot of wonder. They kept this character alive in the common parlance of fantasy fans until the character got the mega boost of all mega boosts by having Arnold Schwarzenegger be in a couple of movies. That is good, but they incredibly muddied the waters. Just incredibly, in terms of the provenance of this body of work. They incredibly muddied the waters. Okay, so I read this story, this Conan story, in the 1970s, and you're telling me now in the 1990s or the early 2000s that it was never a Conan story, that it was not Robert E. Howard, that he wouldn't have recognized it? There's a lot of unlearning to be done because of these books, but nevertheless, when I saw Michael K. Vaughan's video, I immediately went to my copies to read some of this stuff, to read some of it. I'm less vulnerable now because now I'm really well familiar with the original Howard corpus of Conan. So I can much more clearly see what liberties are being taken where and when and how and why in these books. So I can treat them with affection. I agree completely with Michael K. Vaughan that if you want to read Conan, don't read these. But don't spurn them either. You come back to them when you're done. If you fall in love with the Hyborian Age, you're going to love these books. And of course, no Conan volumes have ever looked better. These all have just unbelievably gorgeous covers. So one of the currently reading things that I did was to go back to this. Go back to one of these. It wasn't this. It was Conan the Buccaneer, I think, that I went to. I have I think all of these things, and they are pretty sturdy. And it's such an ecstatic experience to go through these. And now I admit, a nostalgic experience for me as well, because these were, in large part, my introduction to the character. But also there's the trusty iPad. Let me get to where we want to go here. There is the Savage Sword of Conan. I'm obviously not reading Savage Sword of Conan it would be a 200-foot tall pile of those old magazines, and I'm not reading that. I'm not masochistic enough to do that. Instead, I'm going through my Savage Swords of Conan one issue at a time electronically. And oh my God, let me get you the one that I read last night. They all have multiple stories in them. They all usually have multiple artists in them. There's usually a lot of editorial content. I read last night number 105. There's the Savage Sword of Conan, number 105. Roy Thomas and John Buscema had long since departed by now. You get some of these later issues up above 100 have kind of funky covers in an interesting kind of way. It doesn't actually hold true to the inside of the magazine. You really have to be reading the inside for the fun of it. This is by, here, can I get the credits for this? This is a story called The Mill. The credits will be in the table of contents anyway. The story is by Don Krar, and the artwork is by Gary Quaspish and Bob Camp. I don't know any of those people. I don't know anything about them. But the story starts off with an army of mercenaries in the snow being chased by ordinary villagers. It's serviceable artwork. It's not that bad. The army's being cut to pieces by ordinary aggrieved villagers who've had enough, and they're just taking up household influence. You can see a sickle there and a pitchfork, but they are victorious over this army, and in the foothills, in the snow, hiding is a small part of that army. It's Conan. There you see him up at the top there. And some of his men who are watching this butchery, and a couple of them want to intervene. They want to, ride down there and show these villagers that we mean business. And Conan says that we would die. I'm in command of this group, and we would die if we did that. We'd die just like our comrades. And they're pretty sullen. These guys. They don't like Conan telling them what to do. It's time we were rid of this Cimmerian captain. Wait till my sight returns and I'll help you. He sleeps too lightly for that. Besides, I want him to see his death coming. Sooner or later, he'll make a mistake. Then we'll slay him. Not even he is a match for all of us. How many Conan people have said that? He's only one man. And the story takes on a macabre twist right away because the men are starving. Conan and his men are starving. They're cut off from their army. They're cut off from supply bases. They are surrounded by people who want them dead. And they come across a naked body from the slaughter in the field, and one of Conan's men wants to start eating. And Conan has to tell him no. He has to say, I'm a barbarian, not a cannibal. And he hands them a piece of leather and says, warm that up by the fire and eat that instead. But it isn't good enough. One of his men sneaks off to do the unthinkable. And the story just propels from there. There is, of course, a supernatural element involved. And I don't know, maybe it's Stockholm Syndrome. I'm starting to warm to these later Conan, Savage Sword of Conan issues. I'm going to read them all, no matter what. No matter how bad they are, I'm going to read them all. So that's currently reading. It's comic books, but it's currently reading. And then one other currently reading that I'm doing, admittedly, it's not much. It can't be much. Not only until dawn tomorrow, but for the rest of this week. I'm going to indulge myself. I'm going to enjoy myself, which is not going to be burying my nose in a book. But I have been doing a little bit of rereading just to keep my hand in, just to keep my sanity. In Dermot McCullough's biography of Thomas Cromwell. I jumped into it at random and started reading his treatment of the so-called Pilgrimage of Grace, in which a large body of ordinary citizens, much like in that Conan story, a large body of ordinary citizens in the north of England took up arms against the closing of the monasteries, the shuttering of the churches, but especially against Thomas Cromwell. They hated Cromwell. They hated the idea that he was polluting the mind of their true prince when he is nothing, when he is nobody, when he doesn't have, 16 generations of ruling the same territory in Devonshire or whatever. It's a very tense period. It's often just a footnote in Henry VIII biographies, but it was a very tense period. The forces that were eventually assembled under the banners of the Pilgrimage of Grace could probably have marched on London. There were that many of them. Henry set out right away, so did Thomas Cromwell, set out right away, arming and mobilizing the nobles of the North, who are only there for that. They're there for that reason, in case the North gets fractious, and also in case, everybody across the border in Wales gets some funny ideas. You've got to have strong warlords up there in the North. And they start immediately levying troops and whatnot. And I think the story is fascinating. I've read probably 5 or 6 books on the Pilgrimage of Grace. And I love the way it's done in The Mirror and the Light by Hilary Mantel, who gets the big blurb on this book. I love the way it's dramatized in The Mirror and the Light. In The Mirror and the Light, you're reading a novel, so you're a little bit of a disadvantage. Hilary Mantel is going to stress some things for dramatic reasons and downplay or eliminate other things. One of my tiny little gripes about the Cromwell novels by Hilary Mantel is that you never really get a sense of how big Cromwell's household was, how big his professional network was. There were hundreds and hundreds of people who owed him everything. And you don't get that impression in the novels. You do get that impression in this book. Boy, oh boy. I mean, I have sung this author's praises many, many times before on this channel, but boy, oh boy, is he good. Sure, boy, oh boy, is he good. In a big boot, no training wheels, real grown-up way of writing history. So I'm not sure if you'd never read a biography of any Tudor figure before and you wanted to read about Thomas Cromwell, I'm not sure that I'd recommend this book. I would ultimately recommend it, but I'm not sure it'd be the first thing that I'd tell you to read at all. It's always been hard for me to describe the differences, but this is so sweepingly comprehensive and deep down in the weeds of the details. I know that it's of course the impression that you want to give if you're a professional historian, and they'll all admit, most of them will admit, that it's an illusion, partially an illusion. You want to give the impression that you know literally everything there is to know about your subject. And Diarmaid MacCulloch does that better than anybody. In fact, so much so that I might be convinced that he really does. It's amazing how much he knows about the smallest, most insignificant aspect or participant in the Pilgrimage of Grace. Just amazing. You would think that the fact that 40,000 rebels in the north were calling for Cromwell and saying he was the reason why they were rebelling, you would think that that would be the thing that would bring Cromwell down. You would think that a monarch like Henry VIII, who blustered but was very cowardly, you would think that that would mean the end, that he would just say, well, to the tower with you. If your head being struck from your shoulders is the price that I have to pay for calming the north, I'll pay it easily. But it doesn't happen that way at all. And that is fascinating, to watch the ins and outs of that. Henry has to write to the rebels, and he has to have his representatives do that as well. He has to argue with them. They're complaining because Henry doesn't have enough nobles on his council. They're not complaining for, up with the working people. Not at all. Not at all. Just the opposite. They're complaining that Henry doesn't have enough old families on his council, that instead he's surrounded by new men who they don't like, especially Cromwell. And Henry has to write to them and say, no, that's not true. On my Privy Council, there are more noblemen now than there were in ye olden days, when you had no complaints. And Diarmaid MacCulloch makes the really good point. It's partially a point against Elton, who wrote about this period in the Tudor Revolution. It's partly meant to sort of score a point on a former academic, but it was a very influential point that Elton made. Diarmaid MacCulloch makes a great point that this is not the beginning of some kind of Tudor revolution in government. It's the end of it. When Henry talks about the Privy Council, he's talking about a body of which Cromwell is just one member, as opposed to my counselors, vaguely, where behind the scenes Cromwell can rule all. It's a wonderful example of what I always talk about, how thrilling history can be when it's played at this level for these stakes, when Diarmaid MacCulloch wants to rewrite familiar assumptions about some of these subjects. In addition to which, he is pretty good at the narrative element of history. This is not what I would call narrative biography, in the sense that he is perfectly willing to stop. He's perfectly willing to go down deep rabbit holes to question details of the records and whatnot. The footnotes in here are amazing. They are a long, ongoing, running conversation about the book. He's perfectly willing to do all of that, and he puts that ahead of telling a what happened next kind of story. But even so, he's really good at the what happened next parts. It's impressing me all over again. The only problem with it is that I get to, I read 30 or 40 pages and then really want to keep going, and I can't keep going. I can't. Especially not now. This is it for indulgence for me. I indulge myself by talking with Ami because that's always a lot of fun. And I'm indulging myself now for half an hour. But now, aside from the bean, I have got, this is the final stretch. This is the make or break stretch. And what I have to do on paper is not possible. So you may see very little of Max Bialystock in the coming day as I disappear into little old ladyland. But I will return. Unlike other booktubers who gradually dwindle their presence on the platform, fewer and fewer videos, fewer and fewer, less and less interest, less and less energy, and then suddenly you're looking at your feed and thinking, hey, it's been months since I saw that guy. Unlike them, I know perfectly well that I can't quit you. So this is something I am going to keep doing. There's just going to be a bump. There's going to be a brief, minimal or non-existent period where I first do the impossible, which I have to admit, there's going to be an extra little tang of joy, because just 2 weeks ago, I was confronted. It wasn't meant aggressively. It wasn't any of you. I was confronted just 2 weeks ago, inadvertently, with the kind of what we now call ageism, just blatant ageism, that has become just standard. It is completely normal now. That if you're not, young, then you're incapable. When those of you who are in my position where we've withstood our share of winters and then some. We've got some scuffs and scars and dings. But in the meantime, because of all that, we have been amassing a certain amount of strength or skill. If you're in that position, if you've ever had that kind of thing just sort of offhandedly tossed in your direction, then you'll probably understand that a little element of doing the impossible here is wrapped up in that as well. First, I'm going to do the impossible, and that means no more videos for a little bit. And then once I'm done with doing the impossible, then I'm going to indulge myself. That will involve you. There will be videos, but there won't be... The bombardment of videos is only going to resume, not that anybody wants it to, but the bombardment of videos is only going to resume once absolutely normal life resumes. And that will still be August. I've been beating myself up in the last few days thinking, oh my God, I'm letting the side down with Book Trek, summer-long event that wraps up in August about Star Trek books. I'm not making any videos. I've been beating myself up about Garb August, Criminali's great August event reading trash, that I'm not making videos. And then I reminded myself that when I get back to making a daily bombardment of videos, between that time and the end of August, I'm going to make more videos in those events than all the other people participating in those events combined for the whole of the event. So I'm not shortchanging anything except all of you who've been sending me very nice emails saying, you know, I turn on your videos, I put them up on the big screen, the family watches them every day, we're always interested in what's interesting you, even if we're never going to read a comic book, never going to read, you know, a Trollope novel, we're still interested in hearing you talk about it. It's sort of, it brings us together. It's a common moment. Or a number of you have said, you know, I have a relative's in the hospital, or a relative's not feeling well, or an older relative who just can't get up out of his chair very often. We sit and watch your videos, so the more you make, the better. Please don't stop making videos. I feel that. I'm incredibly honored by that. And I will continue to do that. I will continue to do that, but not for the next few days. So I want to give you a brief sort of overview, very paltry overview, of what I've been reading, what I've been thinking about some of it, what you might think about some of it. But now I have to disappear. So I will disappear for now. I will be back. I will see you then. Thank you, BookTube.